I was talking to you last week about the Gothic and how Gothic literature explores psychological aspects of humanity. Yeah, you can get a print here, prints here, or you can get your homework as well. Okay, all right. All right. I'd like to explore that question of psychology, the way that the Gothic explores things. We talked about monomania, paranoia, various things like that that were starting to be talked about in the early 19th century. And it's connected with a growing interest in madness, and it's also a gender item, okay? Okay, I'll mark you as being late, I'm afraid. Okay, all right. It's also a gender issue, so I want to look at madness, particularly in the context of women. Many more Victorian women were considered mad than men. Let's try and understand that and see why. I'm going to focus particularly on Jane Eyre, and one or two people who were in my writing class. Well, we have done some of this before, so can I stick with that? Sorry, you've seen some of this before, but I think it's useful for everybody. At the beginning of Charlotte Bronte's novel, the young Jane is locked up by her aunt, and it's a punishment for being passionate. You see, women were not supposed in the 19th century to be passionate. Here she is. She goes into the Red Room, and she's attacked by her nephew. Her bullying, sorry, her nephew, no. What am I saying? Her cousin. And her bullying cousin, John Reed, comes in and torments her. She's peacefully reading, okay? All right, there she is peacefully reading, and in he comes, and he hits her and bullies her. I felt him grasp my hair and my shoulder. He had closed with a desperate thing. I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer. I felt a drop or two of blood from my head trickle down my neck and was sensible of somewhat pungent suffering. These sensations for the time predominated over fear, and I received him in frantic sort. So she fought back against her bullying cousin. She didn't just put up with him mistreating her. She fought back. And the housekeeper and the maid arrive, and they are very scandalized by the fact that a little girl is fighting back against, well, they don't see John Reed as a bully. They see her as a naughty little girl attacking this nice little boy, John Reed. They don't seem to understand that John is a bully. Dear, says the housekeeper, what a fury sorry, I think it's the maid who says this. What a fury to fly at Master John. And the housekeeper said, did anybody see such a picture of passion? Again, that word passion. Okay, women were not supposed to be passionate. So then her aunt appears and says, take her away to the Red Room and lock her in there. So she's punished by being locked up in a room by herself. Okay, there she is. She's in the Red Room. She's locked in there, and she's going to be locked in there for several hours. And she panics. She's a little girl with a lot of imagination, and she panics because this is the room where her uncle died, and she imagines that she sees his ghost. She's supposed to be screaming there, but we don't seem to be hearing her. Why not? I don't know why not. I'll have to fix this. I'm always having this problem with the sound in here. It doesn't seem to come out with the right, from the right speakers or something. So I'll have to fix that later on. We'll leave it for now. Anyway, she has a kind of fit, and she falls unconscious, and she's taken in the end to a bed where she can recover. And she's being looked after by a kindly man called Mr. Lloyd, who is a little bit less than a doctor. If it had been her own children, Mrs. Reed would have called the doctor, but she's just looking after Jane. She doesn't care about her very much. And so she just gets an apothecary who is lower than a doctor. But he is a good man, he is a kind man, and he takes pity on Jane and tries to understand what's going on with her. Now, all through her life, later on in the novel, she talks about the effect of being in the Red Room, and she says, it only gave my nerves a shock of which I feel the reverberation to this day. Even now, she can feel what a terrible experience it was to be locked up in that room like that. For a sensitive little girl to be locked up in a room where she believes there's a ghost, well, it had a huge effect on her. But you see, she is lucky. She has these fearful pangs of mental suffering. She has the shock, the reverberation of which she still feels, but it's not much, really. It could have been much, much worse. Could have been much worse for her. Suppose it hadn't been Mr. Lloyd, the kind, good-hearted Mr. Lloyd, who tries to find out what's really going on with the poor girl. Suppose it hadn't been him. Suppose it had been someone who thought that she was mad. Now, she was passionate, she was overexcited, she was feverish, she was, from some people's way of thinking, that could be a sign that she was mad. It could happen a lot more easily than you might think. She was hysterical, screaming, shouting. She was imagining things. There wasn't really a ghost in there. She was behaving in an extreme way, and she'd worked herself emotionally into a fit. She'd lost consciousness. For some doctors, especially if the doctor's a man, that could be considered a sign of madness, even today. And the fearful pangs of mental suffering that she experiences could have been seen, could have been interpreted as mental illness. And just remember, in those days, all the doctors were men. There was no such thing as a woman doctor in the early 19th century when this story is set. So all the doctors were men. She could have been seen by a man who just thinks, well, she's hysterical, she's imagining things, she's getting into a feverish fit, she's lost her consciousness, she's crazy. That's not normal. All right? This was something that could easily happen. Even in the late 19th century, here in 1887, you can see a room full of doctors, all men, with a learned doctor, professor kind of showing a mad woman, a hysterical woman. So from a man's point of view, when a woman shows her emotions or shows her passions, she has to be careful in the Victorian world. She could be considered crazy if she appears unable to control her passion or unable to control her emotions, then she can be called crazy. And There are quite a lot of books written about this, but Elaine Showalter's book, The Female Malady, writes about how madness during the 19th century was becoming feminized. It was made something connected with women. It was a sort of feminine thing, the feminization of madness. She writes, disturbing images of wild, dark, naked men had been replaced by poetic, artistic and theatrical images of a youthful, beautiful female insanity. So if you look at the 18th century or the 17th century, their picture of madness is mostly connected with men. But by the time you get into the 19th century, madness is becoming a women's illness. And this is partly because women in Victorian England are being strongly repressed. And the emotions that women feel are being seen in themselves as a kind of madness. Instead of saying, well, wait a minute, women are wired up differently from men, women behave differently from men, women in emotional situations will cry. Men usually won't. But as soon as a woman became emotional, the male doctors or the whole male-dominated society would say, oh, that's not normal. Goodness me. All right? So there'd be a pressure on the woman to try to keep her emotions inside and to try to control herself, to try not to show her feelings in that way. This was also something that was expected of women in their sexual relations, in their marital relations. In the literature of the 17th or 18th centuries, women can be very emotional and very passionate, but in the 19th century, they're supposed to be ukemi, they're supposed to be passive. They're not supposed to want to make love or something like that. The man wants to, the man has the appetite. The woman is just supposed to she's passively accepting it. She's not really expected to want that or to have that kind of appetite herself. She's not, she's being sort of desexualized in a certain way. And again, she's kind of romanticized, the mad woman. She's beautiful, she's poetic, but in her brain she's strange, she's weird. Okay, so there's a romanticizing of the mad person and a feminizing of the mad person. So Elaine Showalter sees this as a paradigm that's coming up after the Enlightenment. You don't just have this world of logic and reason in the Enlightenment, you have a shift towards the idea that women are not part of logic, not part of reason. The Enlightenment, in a sense, is a masculine thing. Women are on the side of irrationality, silence, nature, and body. Men are on the side of reason, discourse, culture, and mind. The Enlightenment is a masculine thing. Men can be scientists. Men can be logical and reasonable. Women just can't. So the Enlightenment becomes a kind of tool for discrimination against women during the Victorian period. And it's being used as a rationale for saying that women should not get the same kind of education as men. Their brains just aren't able to function in that way. So on the male side, you've got reason, discourse, culture, and mind. You've got activity and independence and a healthy, what they called a healthy sexual appetite. Men were supposed to be active in their sexual appetite, whereas women were irrational, they were silent, they were connected to nature and the body, and they were passive and dependent, and they were supposed to be chaste and demure. They were not supposed to be active in their sexuality. So once they start showing their emotions, particularly in a sexual context, that's kind of taboo in the Victorian period. And if women don't live up to these expectations, if women can't be what men expect them to be, then they are likely to be called insane. So Jane, in her bed, after she's been in the Red Room, Jane is pretty lucky, really. All that needed for a person to be declared insane was the signature of 2 doctors. One of them would examine her and say she was mad. The other one would agree, and that's it. She would be declared mad. And the doctors, of course, as I said, were all men. So if the woman behaved in a hysterical kind of way, then they were likely to consider that she was insane. Jane really has had a lucky escape here. Now, another character in this novel by Charlotte Bronte is Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic. The Mad Woman in the Attic is a famous essay written 30 years ago or so, focusing on Bertha and the Victorian view of madness. And if we follow the dates of the novel, then it would be a couple of years later, in 1820, that Bertha Mason is declared mad. In the novel, the central male character, Rochester, has married a Creole woman from Jamaica. A Creole was a white Jamaican. They went hundreds of years before the Shokuminchi-Jidai, or a long time before the time of the British Empire. They went as early settlers to America and the Caribbean. Bertha Mason is a white Creole. She's not considered properly English. She's not black. She's kind of a sort of an in-between kind of culture. Those people who went to places like Jamaica in the 16th or 17th century, they lost a lot of their European culture. And when the later Shokuminchi-Jidai, when the British Empire started and large numbers of white people came over, they suddenly, well, they're white, but don't they speak in a strange way? Don't they dress in a strange way? Don't they dance strange? They move their bottoms when they dance, for example, which, English people, they dance like this. These people were dancing like black people, they're moving their bottoms around. And just the whole culture was like a big sort of shock to them. So Creoles were looked down on. And what Rochester has done is he's married a Creole woman because she's rich, basically. And then she goes mad, or does she? It's a big debate. Does she really go mad, or does the society push her into being mad? But she ends up locked into the attic in Rochester's house. Now that might be surprising as well. You might think, if she's mad, shouldn't she go to a hospital? But the conditions in the hospital were often worse. If a rich man could keep his crazy wife, his mad wife, in his own house, that was considered a kindness. Can you hear the noise of my emails all right, can't you? Doesn't seem to be a problem. Anyway, so let's look at the kinds of treatment that a mentally ill person would have expected to receive. It's all about physical confinement, putting people in little boxes, strapping them to chairs, putting things on their head to prevent them from moving their head around. All about physical limitation. Chains, literally, just like for prisoners. And a straitjacket that would be put on, and the ropes would be tied. You wouldn't be able to move your arms. These kinds of confining pieces of equipment. A bed, again, you'd be strapped to that bed so that you couldn't move. Physical restraint. In the early part of the 19th century, that's what it was all about. You physically restrained them. For some reason, they thought that was going to help. I mean, our common sense now says, well, that's just going to make things worse, isn't it? I mean, you might want to restrain them if they're being a danger to other people, or if they're a danger to themselves, but you would want that to be for as short a time as possible. You wouldn't want to keep them restrained physically like that. That's just going to make things worse, surely. Okay? But for some reason in the 19th century, in the early part of the 19th century, they couldn't see that. Early psychiatrists, people like these that I mentioned here, Charles Worth, Gardner Hill, John Connolly, people who came before Freud and Jung, who were sort of end of the 19th century, these people at least managed to change that. But at the time of Jane Eyre, in the early 19th century, that's what a person diagnosed as mad could normally expect. Physical restraint. And Bertha, in a sense, is also lucky, because she's not restrained in that kind of way. She's just locked up in the attic at her husband's house, and a servant looks after her, watches over her. So from a 19th century point of view, Bertha also is lucky. And she's even able to escape. Sometimes Grace Poole falls asleep in the room, and Bertha takes the key and gets out, and she ends up burning the house down at the end of the novel. So she kills herself at the end of the story. But there's a connection here between Jane, who's locked up in the Red Room for just a few hours, and Bertha, who's locked up, for all her life. The question becomes, is Bertha mad because she's locked up, or is she locked up because she's mad? Which way around is it? Okay, was she just a passionate woman, or showed her an emotional woman? After all, she was a Creole. Her culture was different. She was more emotional, more free, until she came to England, and she couldn't accept the kind of English way of doing things. Was she really mad? Well, really, it's all fiction. But what's happening here? In the novel, Bertha has no words. She doesn't speak to us. She is kept silent. Charlotte Bronte doesn't give her the chance to argue her own idea or to express what she's thinking. We only hear about her from Jane and from Rochester, so she's silenced. Okay, I might want to just a minute now. I might want to see if I can get the volume control here, because so Bronte does want us to see Bertha as mad in herself, but there's a big debate among today's critics about how realistic that is. We don't usually think that madness goes from generation to generation today, except for some particular special kinds of madness. But this kind of hysterical madness coming from a sort of emotional nature is usually, if it leads to madness, that's usually because the environment has pressured people in some way. So Bronte wants to see Bertha as identekini, ni, kind of becoming mad because it's her genetic nature. But there's a lot of debate about that from more recent critics. Bronte, though, tells us that Bertha's mother and grandmother both went mad. So she wants us to think that it's something that's going through the generations. And it is true that medical science at the time tried to think of illnesses coming through generations, madness. Oh, if her mother was mad, of course she'll be mad. That sort of thinking, which we don't really follow so much in modern medical thought. Sorry, I put last week because that was a presentation. I haven't revised. Nothing to do. Forget last week. I didn't talk about this last week. Okay, I just didn't change it from the print from the last time I used a version of this presentation. So anyway, Rochester is kind of paying for his mistake in marrying a Creole woman, and that's what Bronte, perhaps she has a kind of mizoku sabetsu story that she wants to say Rochester made a big mistake marrying a woman who wasn't English. But for modern readers, it's not really Rochester paying for the mistake of marrying a foreigner. Modern readers don't usually look at the story that way. They usually think that he's paying. His punishment is that he doesn't try to understand a woman's mind. He doesn't try to understand the passionate nature of a woman, and he just tries to control that passionate nature instead of trying to understand it. So in that way, if we're looking at Jane Eyre as a feminist novel, in some ways Bertha is the feminist figure, not Jane. Jane is the one who marries Rochester and becomes, in the end, although she's passionate at the beginning of the novel, she ends up as a kind of Sunao housewife to Rochester. Bertha is the one who's saying, no, although we don't hear her voice, her whole existence symbolizes a fight against people like Rochester, men like Rochester. There she is, all right, at the end of the novel, burning the house down as a kind of symbol of protest against the whole masculine world that declares that she, with her woman's mind, her woman's way of looking at things, that she is insane. It's the only revenge that's possible to her. She's locked up. She's not given a chance to speak. She has no other way to express her feelings against the person who is oppressing her. This would be a modern feminist way of looking at Jane Eyre. When the book was written, people did not think about it like that. But from a modern point of view, Bertha is the kind of symbol of the woman fighting against the oppression of the man. And so we've got her gender, she's a woman. We've got the empire, she comes from one of the Shokuminchi. We've got her madness. All of these three things come together. She's the victim of men. Men who colonize, men who traumatize, men who oppress women. This is Victorian society. And this would be the modern feminist way of approaching Bertha through critical works like The Mad Woman in the Attic, which was published about some 30 or so years ago. But what about Jane? Is she insane in some way? She's got people influencing her. Her teacher is Miss Temple. Her friend, her school friend, Helen Burns, who's a very Sunao kind of Christian girl. They teach her the Victorian way for women. Be obedient. Be a good little girl. And they teach her how to control her passion, how to keep her feelings under control. But imagine, it's her wedding day. She's going to marry Mr. Rochester. And just when she's in the church, ready to marry the man that she loves, somebody comes and says, "Stop, you can't marry. He has a wife already." Imagine the trauma for Jane. How will Jane react to this trauma? Will she become mad? And the novel expresses, yes, Jane, in certain ways, Jane becomes mad at this point. Let's look at how it's described. She has the choice of whether she's going to stay with Rochester. He says, okay, yes, I have a wife, but my wife is crazy. I love you. I can't love this crazy woman locked up in the attic. She's mad. I love you. I can't marry you. Okay? Victorian law, he cannot divorce just because his wife is mad. He cannot divorce. He cannot have two wives. He can't marry Jane if he's got one wife already. So the only possibility is he must either forget about Jane, or Jane can live as his mistress, which is a scandal. And Jane says, "No, I'm not going to stay as your mistress. If I stay as your mistress, I know what will happen. You won't respect me. I'll be like your kind of Vaishnu. Okay, you'll look down on me as a sort of, lost woman, fallen woman. So you won't respect me." So she insists on leaving Thornfield, where Rochester lives, and leaving Rochester himself. And it's interesting to notice the words that she uses here. "I will keep the law given by God and sanctioned by man. I will hold to the principles received by me when I was sane and not mad as I am now." You see, the situation has made her crazy. She's saying, "I'm mad. All I can do is hold on to my religion, hold on to the sort of common sense, the joshiki of my belief that I knew before I went mad. But I am right now, I am mad. I'm not normal." You see, even she thinks that her emotion means that she's mad. I mean, most of us now, we'd say, well, if that happened to me on my wedding day, I'd be pretty upset. I wouldn't expect people to tell me I was mad. Okay? But even she thinks that she's mad here. Laws and principles are not for the times when there's no temptation. It's easy to be Sunao when there's when there aren't any problems. I need to remember those laws and principles now when I'm in difficulty. So I am insane, quite insane. My veins running fire, my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. Preconceived opinions are all I have at this hour to stand by. I have to remember what I thought was right before I was insane. But right now, even she thinks that her emotions make her mad. So even the woman herself believes that by having those strong emotions, she must be mad. Okay? Victorian England, even the woman herself would say, oh yes, it's true, I'm mad. So this is what happens. She knows she's not stable enough herself, mentally. She can't trust her own judgment, so she makes the decisions based on the laws and rules of correct behavior. And she also says that she's putting her trust in God. What she does next, from a common sense way of thinking, is pretty crazy. I mean, she runs away on her own. She's got no money. She doesn't know where she's going. She just needs to get away from Rochester, but she has no money. She has no place to go, and she goes off on her own to somewhere where she knows nobody. Now, in the novel, in the 19th century novel, people tend to get rewarded or punished for their behavior. She gets rewarded here. She's not punished for going off in that crazy way. It's like God is looking after her. God is guiding her. She puts her trust in God and God helps her. She runs away. Can't get the volume to work. What's going on? Oh well. Supposed to be hearing pittering rain falling here. Not coming. I don't know why. And she runs and she knocks on a stranger's door, and hey, guess what? It turns out to be the home of her cousins. Of all the houses in England, God's looking after her, and she knocks on the door of her own cousins, people that she didn't know even existed. And the man of the house, St. John, says, come into the house through these three cousins that she didn't know existed and that she finds by random chance, as if God was guiding her to their door. She learns that she's inherited a fortune. She's not a poor orphan anymore. She's got family, she's got money. So her crazy behavior, just running away from Rochester, is rewarded in the novel. The 19th century seems to have this kind of belief that somehow God is looking after us. He used the same belief to say, this is why England is the leading country in the world. God has chosen us. That's how they talk about the today. Because God has chosen, it is their right to have the empire. So, okay. Oh, we can hear the voice. Sort of cracking away. All right. Now what's happening now? So Bronte is rewarding Jane for her apparently irrational behavior. And we suppose this is because she's denied her passion for Rochester. She's put her trust in God. And one of the words that we get here, coming up several times in the story, is the word wild. Wild. Of course, wild is a word connected with nature, isn't it? Things which are natural are wild. But also wild meaning uncontrolled, passionate. So wild belonging to nature, and wild being uncontrolled, being passionate. Before Jane leaves Rochester, he calls her a resolute, wild, free thing. And when she leaves his house, she says, I was weeping wildly. And I went like one delirious, like a crazy person again. But all the time, she believes that God must have led her on through the wilderness. Okay, again, that word wild, wilderness. And then on a wild night, that word again. Worn out and in the last degrees ghastly, wild and weather-beaten, she comes to the door of her cousin's house. So this wildness is seen as part of her woman's nature, and part of what makes a woman mad is that sense of being connected with nature and wild, rather than connected with logic and being reasonable. It's one of Bronte's favourite words, actually, wild. It comes into Jane Eyre about 80 times, with wild or wildly or wilderness in different forms. That word comes in a lot of times. Mostly it's applied to the landscape, to Rochester, to Jane, and to Bertha. But what's interesting is the way that Jane is wild and free, whereas Bertha is wild and chained. She's a wild animal, a wild beast that needs to be kept chained up, locked up. So the challenge for a woman here is to be wild, but not to be wild and chained, not to be wild and locked up, but to be wild and free. Obviously, that's what you want. Jane manages to hold on to her humanity and to keep her self-respect and her conscience, whereas Bertha loses all of those human qualities. She becomes an animal or a goblin, which is a kind of ugly kind of magic kind of creature, kind of elf or magic sort of creature. She becomes dehumanized in her madness. So that the challenge for Jane is to be wild and free rather than being wild and chained. But the way to achieve freedom, the paradox of this is that she only becomes free if she accepts the rules of society. So women are free within the limits of Victorian society, and those are very strict limits. Rochester says, "Jane, be still. Don't struggle so like a wild, frantic bird that is rending its own plumage in its desperation. Stop struggling like a wild bird. Stop struggling to escape. Just accept my control. Accept that you are under my control." And she answers, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will." She's making a feminist statement of her own independent existence, her own independent mind. But in Victorian England, that's a pretty difficult thing for a woman to do. She's got more than twice the chance of a man of being locked up and called crazy, like Bertha. Jane gets a lucky ending in that sense. She learns to control her passionate nature and to become a good housewife to Rochester. So many people feel that in the end, Bronte's novel, the big message, the message we're getting from Jane, is not the feminist message. She just learns how to be controlled by the Victorian male-dominated society, controlled by her husband, Rochester. Bertha is the wild one, and she dies. But a woman cannot really, in that Victorian England, a woman cannot really break free. So we'll be doing more gender stuff connecting to women and their position in Victorian society, because it's a very big topic. At the beginning of the century, women had almost no rights. By the end of the century, women's rights are clearly on the agenda, and we're moving much more towards the kind of world that we have today, where most of you here are women, okay? But 200 years ago, or at the time that Jane Eyre was written, there were no women in universities at all. Zero. Right? We moved on. So the 19th century, one of the big topics of the 19th century is this development of women, how women come into society and become part of the man's world, becomes a shared world between men and women to a much greater extent. So we'll be coming back to this topic later on. Well, that's about it for today. It's about 10 minutes early, but I think that's all I really need to tell you about. So I'm going to stop there. I'll say a little bit about your term paper and things like that afterwards, but as far as the presentation is concerned, that's it.